This is Chapter 19 of The Americans, the Post-War Boom, the American Dream in the 1950s. Section 1 of Chapter 19 is entitled Post-War America. After World War II, returning veterans faced a severe housing shortage. In response to the crisis, developers used assembly line methods to mass-produce houses. The developer William Levitt bragged that his company could build a home in 16 minutes for just $7,000. With this, the suburbs were born. Many veterans used the government-supplied GI Bill to afford guaranteed low-interest rate mortgages so that they could purchase these homes. This is a form of government-financed socialism. The 1950s also redefined the American family, and a return to traditional roles after the war was normal. Men were expected to go to work, while women were expected to stay home and care for the children. Conflict naturally emerged as many women wanted to stay in the workforce. Divorce rates surged in the 1950s. Experts who had predicted a post-war depression were proved wrong as they failed to consider the $135 billion in savings Americans had accumulated from defense work, service pay, and investments in war bonds. All of these were forced savings by the government. After the war, Americans were ready to buy consumer goods. Despite growth, many issues persisted. One persistent post-war issue involved labor strikes. In 1946 alone, 4.5 million discontented workers, including steel workers, coal miners, and railroad workers, went on strike. President Truman refused to let the strikes cripple the nation, and he threatened to draft the striking workers and then order them as soldiers to return to work. This dictatorship over the American people is a symbol of how the military might of the United States caused our leaders to overstep the traditional limits on power that the government had been held to prior to World War II. Now the president was threatening at the point of a gun to draft people and force them to work. The choice of working or going to jail was all they had. And the strategy worked as the striking workers returned to their jobs. However, social unrest persisted. Many African Americans felt that they deserved equal rights, especially after hundreds of thousands of African Americans served in World War II. Truman took action in 1948 by desegregating the armed forces. This follows the same story as our recent debate over the desegregation of gays in the military. In fact, many of the arguments against desegregating the armed forces in 1948 were the same as were used most recently when they argued against allowing homosexuals to serve openly in the armed forces. Many conservatives claimed that homosexuals, and in 1948 they claimed that African Americans would demoralize the troops and make the army less ready to serve the needs of the nation. Obviously, all of these arguments are ridiculous, and Truman, to his credit, saw right through them. Additionally, Truman ordered an end to discrimination in the hiring of government employees. Truman's heavy-handed approach to the American economy led to a very close election in 1948. The Democrats nominated President Truman in 1948, and Republicans nominated the New York governor Thomas Dewey. The polls showed Dewey held a comfortable lead going into the election day, as many Americans were tired of Democratic presidents after having 4 presidencies of Franklin Roosevelt, and now Harry Truman. Truman won a stunning upset over Dewey in the election of 1948. Truman's "Give 'em Hell, Harry" campaign worked. Truman won a very close race against Thomas Dewey. Here you can see him holding up the newspaper of the Chicago Daily Tribune, which had been printed with the belief that Dewey would win. However, Truman won the election incredibly closely. Here's an electoral map showing the election of 1948. The yellow states voted for Harry Truman, and the blue states for the Republican Thomas Dewey. The Democrats also faced a challenge in the Deep South by Senator Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat Party, and you can see Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina all voted for Strom Thurmond. You see, with the desegregation of the military, racists in the South felt that this was a bad choice, and even though they were Democratic, they wouldn't support Truman, instead supporting the openly racist Senator Strom Thurmond, who continued to serve in the United States Congress until he died in 2001. That's 1948 to 2001. Republican planned for the 1952 election. By 1951, Truman's approval rating had sunk to an all-time low of just 23%. Why was this? Well, the Korean War was raging with no end in sight and no clear purpose for the American military to be involved. Also, there was the rising tide of McCarthyism. Senator McCarthy was claiming that Harry S. Truman was allowing for communists to serve in the American government, when in fact all he had done was allow African Americans to serve in the American government. And there was a general impression that Truman was ineffective. Therefore, Dwight D. Eisenhower, when he was picked by the Democrats, or by the Republicans, had a very weak challenger, as Harry S. Truman chose not to run for re-election in 1952. The Democrats nominated the intellectual Governor Adlai Stevenson, while the Republicans nominated war hero Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower used the slogan, "I like Ike," for his presidential campaign. Ike was his nickname, Ike Eisenhower. Republicans used Ike's strong military background to emphasize his ability to combat communism worldwide. They did not remind people that Eisenhower had been one of the soldiers who had fired upon the Bonus Army in 1931 when Hoover ordered the Bonus Army to be destroyed. Ike's vice president, however, makes a major blunder. One potential disaster for Eisenhower was his running mate's alleged slush fund, a secret campaign cash account. Richard Nixon was Ike's vice presidential nominee, and he responded by going on television and delivering an emotional speech denying the charges, but admitting to accepting one gift for his children, a dog named Checkers. Nixon lied, of course. He had a slush fund. He had been taking money for years and was one of the most corrupt politicians in American history. But it is significant because it shows how the power of a good television approach can influence the American people to ignore the obvious corruption of our political candidates. The Checkers speech, as it was called, saved the ticket. Ike wins in 1952 in a major landslide. Here you can see the electoral map showing most of the blue states going for Republican Eisenhower and the yellow states, mostly in the South, voting for Adlai Stevenson. Chapter 19.2 is about the American dream in the 1950s. After World War II ended, Americans turned their attention to their families and jobs. New businesses and technology created opportunities for many people. By the end of the 1950s, Americans were enjoying the highest standard of living in the world. And here is a picture showing the television show The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, which reflected the perfect American family. Notice, everyone has a full head of hair, beautiful white teeth, beautiful smiles. They're all white, no tattoos, no poverty, no imperfections. The organization and the organization man. In the 1950s, businesses expanded rapidly as the American economy was set up to rebuild the economies of Europe and Asia. More and more people held white-collar jobs. White-collar jobs are office jobs, clerical jobs, management jobs, or professional jobs like accountants, doctors, lawyers. The fields of sales, advertising, insurance, and communication exploded. These are very uninteresting, unexciting, very corporate, blend in and make no difference jobs. But they paid well, and that's what people want. Social conformity was the standard for the day. American workers found themselves becoming standardized. Called the organization man, the modern worker struggled with a loss of individualism. Businesses did not want creative thinkers, rebels, or anyone who would rock the boat. Here is a funny poster with the idea of conformity, saying, when people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate each other. Despite their success, some workers questioned whether pursuing the American dream exacted too high a price, as conformity replaced individuality. Conglomerates emerged. Conglomerates, major corporations that include a number of small companies in unrelated fields, emerged in the 1950s. One conglomerate, International Telephone and Telegraph, ITT, bought rental car companies and hotel chains. One example of this today might be the Pepsi-Cola Company, which owns Frito-Lay, and Frito-Lay owns Taco Bell. Franchises began to emerge in the 1950s. Another strategy for business expansion was franchising. A franchise is a company that offers similar services in many locations. McDonald's is one of the world's leading franchises. Fast food restaurants first developed franchises in America. The suburban lifestyle. Most Americans worked in cities, but few and fewer of them lived there. New highways and affordability of cars and cheap gasoline, made possible by government-controlled prices, made commuting possible. Of the 13 million homes built in the 1950s, 85% were built in suburbs. For many, the suburbs were the American dream. And this is a picture showing the American dream, complete with a white picket fence. In fact, the development of many towns, like Brentwood, California, reflect this even today. Many towns were built after 2000 with cheap mortgages made available for people to buy their own image or piece of the American dream. The baby boom is what we call the late 1940s through the 1960s, when the birth rate in the United States soared. Never before and never since have so many babies been born in such a short amount of time. At its height in 1957, a baby was born in America every 7 seconds. Over 4.3 million babies were born in 1957 alone. Baby boomers represented the largest generation in the nation's history. And their generation saw the growth of every service and sector of our economy when they needed it. More doctors were needed to birth these babies. Some more doctors graduated from medical school. When they entered kindergarten, more schools were built than ever before. In the 60s, when they went to college, more people went to college than ever before, and new opportunities for college graduates were created after they graduated in the late 60s and early 70s. What are the official years of the baby boom generation? Well, 1946 to 1964. And you can see here on this chart just how the rise and fall of the baby boom years in the United States looks. Why so many babies? Well, husbands returned from the war. There was a lower age to get married. Many people wanted large families. There was an overwhelming confidence in the American economy. And there was an advancement in medicine that allowed many people to become pregnant and carry a child to birth than ever before. What will this mean to you? Well, looking at this chart, you can see the population as it deals with the baby boom generation. The baby boom generation is shown in purple here, and your generation, of course, is shown later on. Your generation will be supporting an increasingly aging population. See. Advances in medicine and in childcare also affected the baby boom generation, as Jonas Salk developed new drugs that combated childhood diseases like typhoid fever and polio. Dr. Spock also wrote the book many baby boomer parents used as guidelines to raise their children. Dr. Spock thought children should be allowed to express themselves, and that parents should never physically punish their children. The impact of the baby boom was a result that 10 million students entered elementary schools in the 1950s. In California alone, a new school was built every 7 days. Toy sales reached an all-time high in 1958 when 1.25 billion toys were sold. Here's another chart showing symbols of the baby boom in suburbia. In one line of the chart you can see the 1950s and in another the 1960s. Hot dog production rose in millions of pounds of hot dogs in just 10 years from 750 million pounds to 1,500,000. Potato chip production also increased by more than 1.5 times. Lawn and porch furniture more than tripled as more people sat outside enjoying their children in the yard. In the yard, power mowers were needed and they sold almost 4 times as many. Sales of floor polishers more than 5 times as many. Encyclopedias for those children to look up new facts and learn new things, well, they increased from $72 million in sales in 1950 to $300 million in 1960. The number of children aged 5 to 14 in 1950, 24.3 million. And in 1960, 35.5 million. Also, the number of baseball Little League teams, or leagues rather, 776 million in 1950, over 5,700,000,000 in 1960. Fads of the baby boomers included hula hoops, frozen foods, poodle skirts and saddle shoes, panty raids, Barbie and G.I. Joe dolls, bikinis, frisbees, yo-yos, Ouija boards, and dune buggies. What celebrities have affected baby boomers the most? John F. Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, Martin Luther King Jr., and John Lennon. Women's roles in the 1950s included both homemaker and mother. They were glorified in popular magazines and on movies and television. Those women who did work were finding job opportunities limited to fields such as nursing, teaching, and office support. Women earned far less than men for comparable jobs. And in fact, for many reasons, these fields continue to offer lower salaries to their employees, proving that it's not that teaching, nursing, and office support are easy jobs, but that they're underpaid because of the sexism that is inherent in the American workplace. Americans also experienced shorter work weeks in the 1950s and more vacation time than ever before. Leisure time activities became a multi-billion-dollar industry. Labor-saving devices also added more spare time. Popular leisure activities in America amounted to $30 billion in profit. Popular activities included fishing, bowling, hunting, and golf. Americans attended or watched on TV football, baseball, and basketball games. Automobile culture also started in the 1950s. After the rationing of World War II, inexpensive and plentiful fuel and easy credit led many Americans to buy the car for the first time. By 1960, over 60 million Americans owned automobiles. In 1956, Eisenhower authorized a nationwide highway network, 41,000 miles of roads linking the United States. He did this not just because of the growing popularity of cars, but because of the desire to be able to move large numbers of soldiers around the country at a moment's notice. You see, the United States remained militarized after World War II, spending billions of dollars on the maintenance of a large military force, even though the United States was at peace with the world. The creation of the interstate highway system in 1956 by Eisenhower allowed Americans to drive across the country for the first time. It also allowed for the military to move men freely around the country. The interstate highway system spurred automania, the construction of roads linking major cities and connecting schools, shopping centers, workplaces to residential suburbs. This plan for development of American roads was exactly the opposite of what the United States was doing in Europe under the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was building large city centers with public transportation, trains primarily, to link the small towns and villages of Europe to these large city centers, forcing the Europeans to not use cars, but rather use public transport. The United States went in the exact opposite direction, not developing public transportation and focusing more on large, more expensive roads and cars. The impact of the highway system included more trucking, less railroad, and more suburbs built further away. Highways homogenized America. America began to look the same. Restaurants, motels, highway billboards, gas stations all began to look similar. The nation had become homogenized. Food tasted exactly the same in Arkansas as it did in Washington State, as it would in Virginia or in Florida or in California. John Keats wrote about the car culture in his book The Insolent Chariots in 1958, and he said, "Our new roads, with their ancillaries, the motels, filling stations and restaurants, advertising eats, have made it possible for you to drive from Brooklyn to Los Angeles without a change of diet, scenery, or culture." The downside to mobility was that while the car industry boomed and produced new jobs, shopping centers, and the restaurant industry, it also had a negative effect in that there was more noise, more pollution, more accidents, more traffic jams, more stress, and the decline of public transportation. By the mid-1950s, nearly 60% of Americans were members of the middle class. Consumerism, meaning the buying of material goods, came to be equated with success and status. For the first time in American history, it didn't matter who you were as much as it mattered what you owned and what you drived and where you lived. The United States had returned to a superficial view of itself. New products. One new product after another appeared in the marketplace. Appliances, electronics, and other household goods were especially popular. The first credit card, Diners Club, appeared in 1950, and American Express cards were introduced in 1958. Because of the new credit cards, personal debt increased nearly 3 times in 1950. The advertising age. As the advertising industry capitalized on runaway consumerism by encouraging even more spending, ads were everywhere. Ad agencies increased their spending 50% during the 1950s as they convinced Americans that they needed to buy the same product again and again because this new product was just a little bit different than the old product. This is called planned obsolescence. Today, we think of it as buying new Apple products every year because the new iPhone is so much better and in many ways exactly the same as the old iPhone. Chapter 19.3 is about popular culture in the 1950s. A new era of mass media, led by television, emerged in the 1950s. In 1948, only 9% of homes had a television. 2 years later, in 1950, 55% of American homes had television. And by 1960, 90% of American homes had television. Today, the average American home has 4 televisions. The golden age of television was the 1950s. Comedies were the main attraction, as Milton Berle, Lucille Ball, and Desi Arnaz were very popular. Television also experimented with other various formats. Television innovations like on-the-scene news reporting, interviews, westerns, and sporting events offered the viewer a variety of shows. Kids' shows like the Howdy Doody Show and the Mickey Mouse Club were very popular. TV ads, TV guides, and TV dinners expanded. TV advertising soared from $170 million in 1950 to nearly $2 billion in 1960. TV Guide magazine quickly became the best-selling magazine as Americans put down their books and picked up the local listings for what was on television. Frozen TV dinners were introduced in 1954. These ready-to-eat meals on disposable aluminum trays made it easy for people to eat without missing their favorite show, regardless of the fact that the food was incredibly toxic and made Americans into an obese people almost overnight. A subculture naturally emerged out of all of this homogeneity. Although mass media and television were widely popular in the 1950s, dissenting voices emerged, calling themselves the beat movement in literature and in rock and roll, which clashed with the tidy suburban view of life. Beatniks followed their own path, being centered in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and in New York's Greenwich Village. The beat movement expressed social nonconformity. Followers of the beat movement, called beatniks, tended to not want to work and sought understanding through Asian religions like Zen Buddhism, music, and even sometimes drugs. Music in the 1950s added electronic instruments to traditional blues music, creating rhythm and blues. Cleveland DJ Alan Freed was the first to play this music in 1951. He called it rock and roll. In the early and mid-50s, Richard Penniman, Chuck Berry, Bill Haley and the Comets, and especially Elvis Presley, brought rock and roll to the forefront of American culture. The driving rhythm and lyrics featuring love, cars, and problems of being young captivated teenagers across the country. Elvis Presley became the king of rock and roll. Presley's rebellious style captured young audiences. Girls screamed and fainted, and boys tried to imitate him. Chapter 19.4 is entitled The Other America. In 1962, nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans was living below the poverty line. Most of these poor were the elderly, single women and their children, or minorities. In the 1950s, millions of middle-class white Americans left the cities for the suburbs. At the same time, millions of African American rural poor migrated into the cities. The so-called white flight drained cities of valuable resources, money, and taxes, showing that as the 1960s fought with the civil rights movement, it was very much a city versus country, black versus white, rich versus poor, social upheaval.